Let's talk about what just happened in Ottawa because Mark Carney may have just torn up the entire playbook the Trump administration was counting on for North America. And Washington hasn't fully processed the implications yet. This isn't a routine policy disagreement between neighboring governments. What Carney's office released yesterday is something far more consequential, a document they're calling the Canadian Sovereignty Framework. And when you actually read through it carefully, what you're seeing is Canada doing something it hasn't done in a very long time, planting its feet and refusing to move. To understand why this matters, you have to understand who Mark Carney actually is. This isn't a career politician who came up through local councils and party backrooms. This is a man who ran the Bank of Canada, who then ran the Bank of England, who chaired the Financial Stability Board and helped coordinate global economic policy after the 2008 collapse. The people around Trump who assumed they could steamroll whoever replaced Trudeau with tariff threats and annexation jokes made a serious miscalculation. They were expecting someone they could rattle. They got someone who has sat across the table from the most powerful financial institutions on the planet and negotiated from a position of principle. So, what does this framework actually do? It works on three levels simultaneously, and each one is aimed precisely at the pressure points the Trump administration has been leaning on. The first piece is what Carney calls economic red lines, sectors that Canada is formally declaring non negotiable: energy, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, and the one that's going to cause the biggest headaches in Washington: fresh water. These aren't areas where Canada is saying it wants better terms. It's saying these topics aren't on the table under coercive conditions. Full stop. Think about what that means for Trump's team. Their entire strategy has been built on the assumption that economic pressure, the threat of 25% tariffs, the constant drumbeat of hostile rhetoric, would force a new Canadian government into a defensive crouch, begging for relief and willing to give up ground to get it. Instead, Carney has looked at that strategy and essentially said, "We know what we have, and we know what you need. So let's see who actually blinks." And here's the uncomfortable reality for Washington. Canada supplies more oil to the United States than Saudi Arabia does, more than Russia does. Canadian electricity literally keeps the lights on in parts of the American Northeast. The lithium, cobalt, and rare earth minerals sitting in Canadian soil are precisely the materials the United States has been desperate to secure from non-Chinese sources, because China has spent years trying to corner that market, and the Americans know it. When Carney's framework says Canada reserves the right to require domestic processing of critical minerals before export, that's not a throwaway line. That's Canada pointing at the one vulnerability the Trump administration really doesn't want to talk about publicly. Reports coming out of the White House suggest Trump has been furious since the framework dropped. Phone calls, demands that his trade team produce a punishing response immediately. And that reaction tells you something important. This landed exactly where Carney intended it to. But the framework is only part of the story. Within hours of releasing it, Carney's office announced a series of state visits: Germany, Japan, South Korea, and Mexico over the coming 6 weeks. On the surface, that looks like a busy travel schedule. Look closer, and it's a deliberate strategic signal. Every single country on that list has been on the receiving end of Trump's economic threats. Every one of them is quietly asking whether there's a better arrangement available. Carney is going to each of them and making the case that there is. This is where his background becomes a genuine geopolitical asset. He knows these finance ministers. He's worked with them. When he calls the German chancellor and suggests they talk about building economic frameworks that don't require American approval at every step, that call gets taken seriously in a way it simply wouldn't coming from a less credentialed figure. He's not pitching a protest movement. He's pitching a structural alternative, and he has the resume to back it up. Trump's mental model of international relations is fundamentally bilateral. America on one side, a smaller country on the other, American leverage doing the work. What Carney is constructing is something that makes that model obsolete: a web of coordinated relationships where middle power countries set common standards, share economic frameworks, and collectively present a front that's much harder to pick apart one country at a time. The section of the framework on regulatory alignment captures this perfectly. Rather than defaulting, as Canadian policy documents have for decades, to the assumption that Canada aligns its regulations with American standards, this one talks about alignment with European Union standards in key areas: data privacy, environmental protection, consumer safety, financial oversight. That's not an accident. It's Carney drawing on what he learned watching European coordination in action, understanding that when countries harmonize standards with each other, they gain collective leverage that none of them would have alone. It also makes Canada a more natural destination for European investment and partnership, which is exactly the diversification he's been signaling Canada needs. Now, let's talk about the water section because it might be the most significant part of the entire document, even if it's getting the least attention right now. Canada holds roughly 1/5 of the world's fresh surface water. As climate change accelerates, as the American Southwest faces deepening drought, as California's agricultural regions confront the limits of what the Colorado River can provide, that water becomes a strategic resource of almost incalculable value. There have been voices in American policy circles for decades quietly floating the idea of North American water sharing infrastructure. Read those proposals carefully, and what they actually describe is diverting Canadian water southward, with Ottawa having limited control over the terms once the pipes are in the ground. The sovereignty framework shuts that door. It declares Canadian freshwater a sovereign national resource managed by Canadian authorities for Canadian citizens and Canadian ecosystems, and explicitly rules out bulk water exports to any country. Carney clearly understands something fundamental about resource negotiations. Once you cede control of something irreplaceable, you don't get it back. He's locking in Canada's position now, before the desperation sets in on the American side and the pressure to negotiate becomes intense. Trump's team may not have fully internalized this yet. When they do, the reaction is going to be severe. Let's address the 51st state idea directly, because it keeps coming up and deserves a clear-eyed response. Canada has a higher life expectancy than the United States. Universal health care, lower rates of violent crime, lower incarceration rates. By multiple measures, the average Canadian carries more household wealth than the average American. What Trump is actually proposing, whether he frames it as a joke or not, is that Canadians voluntarily dismantle a social infrastructure that, by most objective metrics, outperforms the American one, in exchange for subordination to a political system that a substantial portion of Americans themselves have lost faith in. Carney's approach to this has been tactically brilliant. He simply doesn't engage with it. He proceeds as though he's dealing with a serious government making serious arguments, and in doing so, he makes the contrast between the two leaders impossible to ignore. The domestic political dimension here is also worth understanding. Carney's approval numbers have moved upward since he adopted this harder posture toward Washington. That's not a coincidence. Canadian public opinion across party lines has hardened considerably. Canadians don't want to be talked about like a piece of real estate, and they don't want a prime minister who responds to that treatment by softening his position. Every threat from Trump, every hostile tweet, every new tariff announcement actually strengthens Carney's hand at home. The political logic that Trump is used to, apply pressure, watch the other side scramble, is running in reverse here. The international audience watching all of this is enormous. Australia, Poland, South Korea, the Gulf states. Every mid-sized democracy that has structured its security and economic relationships around American partnership is asking the same question right now. If Canada can hold this line, what does that mean for us? Carney seems to understand that he's not just defending Canadian interests in isolation, he's demonstrating a model. He's showing that it's possible to maintain a constructive relationship with the United States while refusing to accept a subordinate position within it. If that model gains traction, if other countries adopt versions of it, the entire architecture of American dominated bilateral leverage starts to erode. That's the deeper conflict here. Not lumber tariffs, not aluminum quotas. The real question is whether American power in the 21st century is absolute or whether it has genuine limits. Limits that other countries can identify, organize around, and collectively enforce. Trump is fighting to preserve the idea that it's absolute. Carney is betting that it isn't. We don't have the final chapter yet. We don't know whether Carney can sustain this posture if Trump follows through with serious economic retaliation. We don't know whether the Canadian economy can absorb that kind of disruption. We don't know whether the coalition Carney is building will actually hold together when the pressure gets real. What we do know is that the assumptions underlying Trump's North America strategy have just been challenged more directly and more credibly than at any point in this administration. And the person doing the challenging has the background, the relationships, and apparently the political support at home to make it genuinely costly to ignore. This is where we are. Two fundamentally incompatible visions of what North American relations look like. One hierarchical, one cooperative, heading toward a confrontation that neither side seems willing to avoid. Watch this space. It's going to move fast.